Very pleased today to have Dr. Diane Zorri. She will be talking about the Iranian Threat Network, which she's done a lot of unclassified research into. So just a reminder, this is an unclassified forum, and this is everything you're seeing is derived from unclassified sources in her.
As Aaron said, he's a fantastic writer, by the way. I loved getting his work, so I always actually would try to edit his stuff. I got lots of work that wasn't that great, so his was a pleasure. So I'm Dr. Zorri, and I am talking about the Iranian Threat Network. But first, I would like to say thank you to SOFWERX for having me. Thank you, Aaron Bazin. Thank you, Tanya in the back. Thank you, Tambrian, and thank all of you for coming out today in this rain. I know you could have easily stayed in your offices, so it's just an honor to see you all here. I know this is a hot topic. So a little bit about me before we get started. As Aaron said, I'm an assistant professor at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. Before that, though, I was actually in the United States Air Force. I was an officer. I went to the Air Force Academy. I'm a graduate of the Naval Postgraduate School. Once I left the Air Force, I went into the defense industry, where I spent a couple years in Baghdad. And my experience in Baghdad really intrigued me, and I wanted to do more with that experience. I came back, went back to the defense industry, and ended up getting a PhD at George Mason using my GI Bill, and then was fortunate enough to come into academia as a professor. So I've been teaching now at Embry-Riddle for 3 years. Oh, one thing, I would be remiss if I did not thank Joint Special Operations University. This whole project was the brainchild of the folks over at Joint Special Operations University. They have funded this research, and they've been extremely supportive of this entire project. And there's a couple of them in the audience here. Pete McCabe, Dave Ellis, thank you very much for supporting me in this endeavor. So a little bit about the agenda. I will go over the research questions that a colleague of mine and I did for this project, and he couldn't be here today. We will talk about the strategic framework for the project. We used 3 cases for the project: Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. I'll talk a little bit about how the proxies are interacting in these places. I'll go through the analysis implications, and then hopefully we'll get into some discussion. One thing Aaron told me was that I had to be disruptive. So I'm hoping that this presentation maybe angers you enough that you will point out things that you think are wrong. And don't hesitate to do that. I know there's a lot of experts here. So if you see something that you think is incorrect, let's talk about it. Let's have that discussion. So again, this is a monograph for JSOW. Some of you probably got the draft, and I want to emphasize this is a draft. It has not been edited. The final edited version will probably come out maybe in 6 months or so, or early next year. So if you're really interested in this project, be on the lookout for that monograph coming out of JSOW at some point. So we looked at 3 things. I really was curious about how Iran is developing, employing, and sustaining their proxy organizations in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. This was a mystery to a lot of folks because in some cases, these proxies are actually stronger than the state itself. Why is this happening? And finally, what are the implications of these proxy groups? Are there any vulnerabilities that we can exploit? So just to give us a little bit of strategic framework, I have to do this. I'm a political scientist. It's all about how we frame everything. This project takes Iran and looks at their proxies going west. So I fielded a couple questions lately about what about Iranian proxies in Afghanistan? What about Iranian proxies in Pakistan? We didn't look at that so much. We're really focused on how Iran is projecting power to the west. And there's 3 major power points that Iran is interested in. 1, they want to create that land bridge through Iraq and through Syria so they can have access to their ports in Lebanon. Why do they want access to the ports? Well, they want to traffic goods and supplies across that land bridge. That land bridge is very vitally important to them, especially under sanctions. They want to be able to export and import goods that they otherwise can't get on the open market. Hence, a lot of these goods that they're trafficking through the land bridge are actually high return on investment items, which are typically black market items, okay? They want to have control over the Straits of Hormuz, and that's been in the news a lot lately. The third area they want to have control over is the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. And as you look at this graph, you can see if they are able to control and project power across that whole region, they squeeze Saudi Arabia. But not only that, they start to squeeze Israel as well. Okay? All right. So the strategic framework here. A lot of you are very intimately familiar with the concept of hegemony. I'm sure it's been touted at the war colleges and beaten into you. So I won't go too much in depth on this. But for those of you that need a refresher on the concept of hegemony, a hegemon is a country that is projecting its power in a way that subdues the other countries around it. In other words, it has a cultural strength, an economic strength, a military strength, a political strength that is much, much, much stronger than countries in its orbit, countries it exports goods to, countries it's dealing with. Hence, that country is essentially setting the rules of the game. Other countries have to subserve themselves to that country's rules. Okay? So if you look at the world today, it's obvious that the United States is a global hegemon. You know, you look at everything from FAA language is in English. Our rules of the seas prevail. Right? If you looked at the world during the Cold War, you could see that the United States and the USSR were hegemons. All right? Now, hegemons act in a way that that isn't only on the global level. They also act regionally. Believe it or not, political scientists and experts in international relations cannot agree right now if there's one global hegemon, two global hegemons, or three global hegemons, or many hegemons. Okay, I asked this question at a conference recently. How many hegemons do you think there are? Is the world unipolar, bipolar, tripolar, multipolar? Disagreement across the board. So this is very subjective, all right, because even the experts can't agree. But I will argue for the duration of this presentation that Iran is seeking regional hegemony. We have to look at this through that lens. They want to set the rules of the game in their region. That is the premise for the entire argument. So, how does international relations work? Well, I will argue that, again, the verdict is out on how this really works. A lot of this is just about framing, because it's very hard to test, okay? But the way that I like to visualize power in the international system is kind of like this rock slide here. Okay, so in this rock slide, imagine you remove one of the rocks from the rock face. Eventually, you might see the cascade of rocks down the mountain, all right? Another way to imagine this is an I-beam in a building. You remove the I-beam, or there's a crack in the I-beam. Okay, the building might not fall apart right away, but eventually things might start cascading into each other. Or a Jenga tower. You remove that one piece in the Jenga tower. Eventually there could be an avalanche. I would argue that Iraq, prior to the 2003 invasion, was like an I-beam in the Middle East. Okay, holding back Iran, holding back Saudi Arabia, pushing back on Israel, and pushing back on the Kurds and Turkey. Okay, it was that I-beam. You remove that I-beam and suddenly these great powers are colliding in that space. Okay? Saddam Hussein, another framework here. So we have the framework of hegemony. Now let's talk about bandwagoning versus balancing. Okay? There's a very famous Iraqi scholar named Joseph Sassoon. He wrote a book about the Ba'ath Party. And in this book, he talks about a book that supposedly Saddam Hussein wrote. Now, we don't know if he actually wrote it. He could have had somebody else write it for him. The book was called Men and a City. And in this book, Saddam Hussein describes the key to understanding his people, the Iraqi people. And what he says is that there's a story that will explain to you how they think. And it goes like this. There's the tribal sheikh. It's World War I time frame. And the Iraqi army is fighting the British. And the tribal sheikh hears that the British army has been successful against a very important Iraqi army faction, an Ottoman faction. So he goes to the post office, and back in those days, you couldn't send email or anything. You had to send a telegram. So he makes a long trek to the post office, and he's going to congratulate the British forces for defeating the Ottoman forces. On his way to the post office, he gets to the post office, he finds out that it actually wasn't the British that won. It was the Ottomans, the Iraqi faction. So he changes his telegram and he says, okay, congratulations, you won. I'm here to support you. Okay, that would be bandwagoning. Bandwagoning is going with the higher power, going with the power that wins. Not really caring who wins, you're just going to go with the higher power. Balancing, on the other hand, is taking a stand on your own, whatever your moral or your compass is, and whatever power tries to come into your region, you fight against it. He said understanding, though, this is Saddam Hussein. He's saying understanding the psyche of the Iraqi people is understanding that they will bandwagon. They will bandwagon with the highest power, always. Okay, so how does this happen? Now, for those of you that are experts on Iranian proxies in Iraq, in Iraq or the area in general, will understand that this is by no means comprehensive. Now, for those of you that this is the first time seeing it, it might seem like an eyesore, and I've got a lot more eyesores. I've got a whole slide deck of eyesores, which we won't go into. Okay, if you have questions about that, we can definitely dip down later. All right, but so this is a generalization. These are, generally speaking, some of the Iranian-trained proxies in Iraq that predate the Islamic State. They're still there, okay? Predate the Islamic State. And these are the Iranian proxies that became very, very notable after the rise of the Islamic State. Notice all of these brigades. Liwas are brigades, okay? And you might be wondering, how is this proliferation happening? How is this even possible, okay? How on earth are these groups growing so much? Well, to understand this, I'm going to try to make you uncomfortable, all right? I think Sun Tzu said, to defeat your enemy, you must know your enemy. But to know your enemy, you must become your enemy. So, for the next few minutes, let's try to become our enemy, all right? I'm going to teach you a class called Hegemony 101. Now, some would argue that the US is a hegemon, so we don't need Hegemony 101, all right? But imagine that you're a small state and that you're seeking hegemony, but you don't have the power, the military, the culture, or anything to back it up. And people don't like you either. How do you become hegemon? Okay, this is Hegemony 101 for the weak state. All right, you're not the United States in this, you're somebody else. All right, the trick is, in Hegemony 101, after you have divided and conquered your state, which is really the military aspect, you move on to the political. Now, Americans are very uncomfortable with this. All right, we don't move on to the political realm. And this is where I'm going to try to make you uncomfortable, okay? How do you control territory when people just don't like you? And when I mean they don't like you, you're culturally different, you're racially different, you're ethnically different, you're linguistically different. How do you get in there and control everybody? All right? Well, let me give you an example, okay? At the micro level, this was a tactic used in the United States by La Cosa Nostra, the American mafia. Okay? Back during the Prohibition, La Cosa Nostra realized that they had a very high return on investment item, alcohol. All right? And they realized if they trafficked this and they sold it, they can make a lot of money. There were a lot of families in New York doing this. And eventually, there were a lot of turf wars. So in order to control the chaos, an individual from the Bonanno family, his name is Salvador Maranzano, realized that, okay, we need to divide and control. I'm going to divide out the entire territory amongst 5 families. Oh, by the way, though, I'm going to be in charge of it. All right? He didn't last long. Lucky Luciano threw him over. Okay? But essentially, he became Gambino, the godfather. Right? Divide and control. Now, on a macro level, how is this done? Let's look to British India. How do you subdue a subcontinent which in 1900 had 250 million people? You're culturally different, you're ethnically different, you're linguistically different, religiously different. How do you subdue an entire subcontinent? Well, the British actually had a policy for this. Okay? Divide and control policy. They would split factions and pit them against each other. If somebody was religiously different, they made sure that that faction was fighting another faction. Therefore, they were always in control. Okay? So let's break this down even more. At the micro level, you will see these tactics done by narcissists, by megalomaniacs, by psychopaths. You probably know a few people that use these tactics in your family, okay? At the macro level, we tend to call this imperialist, all right? And we try not to be that way. We don't want to be imperialist, okay? I think we might have ended up hegemon on the global stage, but I think a lot of Americans see that as happenstance. Okay, we weren't actively seeking hegemony. It sort of happened, and now we've inherited this world, and we're trying to keep it sane, okay? At least that's our view, I think. So how do you do this, okay? You actively create and foster and promote divisions and cleavages in your host. The host is the place where you go, okay? So you're like a parasite. You got to get into that host and start dividing things up. Never, ever, ever empower a minority faction, okay? Never empower the majority, always empower minority factions. Now, if you think about this, for those of you that know Iraq really well, when we went into Iraq, we took the minority faction out of power and empowered the majority. Big mistake. If you want to stay in a country and have hegemonic control, you never empower a majority faction because they're going to kick you out the first chance they get. They don't need you. If you empower the minority, they always need you. The minority knows the country. They understand the people. They know the culture. They know the divisions. They understand the nuances. But they can't rule it by themselves. The minority needs you. For what? Weapons, support, money, etc. So you empower minority factions. You don't come in and empower the next George Washington or General Grant or Abraham Lincoln. Okay, you shy away from amazing, great leaders. You empower toxic leaders, tractable leaders, pliant leaders. The last thing you want is really amazing people running your country that you're trying to have control over. You empower the most tractable, okay? Keep people dependent on you. You get these tractable people, these people that maybe aren't the brightest guy, brightest bulb in the bunch, and you get him to depend on you for charitable giving. That can be weapons, that can be training, that can be resources. Okay? You encourage your host to spend as much money as possible on things that are useless. Now, useless is in the eye of the beholder, all right? But if you can get them to spend billions on refurbishing religious institutions, great, okay? Encourage that. And finally, when your emergent leader becomes too powerful and starting to act like they don't need you anymore, repeat. That's how you keep your foothold in the country, and that's exactly what Iran has done. So what are the benefits here? Well, it gives you the perception of ever-increasing power. As your factions split, there's more and more and more and more of them. People on the outside are wondering, how are you getting so much power? So many people are following you. Well, you're just splitting, okay? Buck passing. You give your dirty work to these guys. You need to hit an American in Taji? Don't do it yourself. Go get one of your proxies to do it. Get Badr to do it. Or there's a guy emerging in Badr who's angry at the leader. Get him to do it, and then you'll give him his own faction. Okay? Play both ends against the middle. Okay? You probably do this with your kids. I do it. Okay? Chris, Lily just took out the trash. Isn't she awesome? What are you going to do to be awesome? okay? This also focuses your population on the external threat, okay? The last thing you want to do as an emergent hegemon is to have cleavages in your own society. You want to get your society focused on all those problems outside the country and get everybody excited about that so you can keep your power. It also prevents others from concentrating any power when you constantly divide people up. So what's the playbook here? The playbook here for Iran, I mean, they're playing a bad hand really well, okay? Their weapons are cheap. And, you know, this is not a picture, this is not a recent picture. This is a picture from the Iran-Iraq war. They were humiliated. Saddam Hussein really humiliated them. They're bigger, they were supposedly a great military, and Saddam Hussein really gave it to them. And Iran lost a lot of people. They're very gun-shy about a major conventional war because of this experience, okay? So they're sticking to the gray zone. Ballistic missiles, proxies doing their job for them, mercenaries, okay? They have a lot of mercenaries. What are their tactics? Okay, sabotage, assassination, gaslighting. Let's talk a little bit about gaslighting. I love this tactic, okay, because Iran's not the only country that does it, okay? It's done by politicians all the time, but Iran does it especially well. So right after, and this is just in the past week, right after Great Britain, so Great Britain actually seized a ship, an Iranian ship bound for Syria in the Straits of Gibraltar. I'm sorry, there's a typo here. Sorry, guys. It's Tehran's duty to now seize a British oil tanker. That's what they said. It's our duty to do this, okay? And then, just a couple days ago, okay, the foreign ambassador to Britain gets, makes a public statement. Iran just wants normal relations based on mutual respect. Iran does not actually seek a confrontation. Okay, this is what he says, in English, in a suit, okay, to the British. And then he congratulates the new prime minister, okay? So you're thinking, am I the crazy one or are they the crazy one? I don't know. They were doing something illegal. We weren't doing anything illegal, all right? All right. So gaslighting is making people think that they're crazy by basically contorting reality, okay? They're experts at that. So Iraq, how are they doing this in Iraq? And we're gonna kind of buzz through these a little bit, and then I'm hoping that, if you've got really specific questions, we can get into that. So just real quick, the distribution of ethnic groups in Iraq, many of you already know this. I hate the generalization, but it's the way that we keep typologizing this country. Western Iraq, Sunni. Northern Iraq, Kurdish. Southern Iraq, Shia Arab. The Baghdad is a mix, all right? I would be remiss if I did not explain the very huge difference between Ayatollah Khamenei and Ayatollah Sistani, okay? The proxies operating in Iraq typically follow one or the other. And there's a huge difference between this guy's philosophy and this guy's philosophy, okay? One way to think about Khamenei is the idea of the state making the people good. So very top-down approach. The state makes the people good. Whereas Sistani, his idea is that good people make the state. So bottom up, okay? Sistani stays out of politics. So while people might support him, militia members might support him, he's not supporting them overtly, okay? He's apolitical for the most part. He sees himself as eternal. This one's more ephemeral, okay? If I had to make a Western analogy, I would say Sistani's kind of like the Pope. Khamenei's kind of like Jerry Falwell. If Jerry Falwell had a successor and Jerry Falwell had taken over the United States and made everybody evangelical Christians, okay? Very different in terms of longevity, perception, and legitimacy. He's legitimate in in Iran. He is legitimate for most Shia in the world, okay? He's got much more legitimacy, okay, throughout the world. Another key component here that I want to talk about is the fact that Ayatollah Khomeini and that regime sees themselves as having the obligation for defending the weak, okay? So wherever there are weak Muslims, they see it as their duty to go in there and defend it. At least that's the narrative that they're putting out there. So when Palestinians need help because big bad Israel is hurting them, they're there to defend the weak, okay? This is the ideology that's enabled them to insert themselves in so many places. They see it as their obligation. Okay, prominent Shia political parties, okay? Now we're starting to get more into the weeds, right? I'll just say that Dawa is the one that's the oldest, okay? Dawa goes back to the 50s. Dawa was suppressed under Saddam Hussein. And the Dawa guys, you see here in suit and tie. The Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq, believe it or not, they got really big right after the Islamic Revolution in Iran. They wanted to export that to Iraq. Saddam Hussein did not like that. These guys were underground as well and then popped up after. Iraq had a major election last year. And I think Iran was very, very intent on, you know, their big bad boy leader over here winning. He was a candidate. He created a coalition. But believe it or not, now take a look at this again. Okay, these are the Sadrists. Look who won. Okay, Muqtada al-Sadr. He got the majority. Okay, you don't really win in parliament, in parliamentary politics. Okay, but believe it or not, Muqtada al-Sadr got the majority, even though, okay, these other Hashid groups, you know, did very well. Muqtada al-Sadr still won that election. Okay, that is a cleavage point, I would say, a very important cleavage between people loyal here and people loyal here. Now, the average guy in the street is kind of like your average guy anywhere. Even there, some people are just not religious. They just follow whoever's paying them, or you know, whoever everybody else is following. That's who they're following. Okay. Syria, really quick. The Alawites, they're a minority faction. Very smartly, the minority faction has been able to maintain control of that country, although the country is majority Sunni. I think after the Arab Spring of, you know, the 2011-2012 timeframe, we saw a lot of potential here until these guys started defecting to Islamic State groups, and then we were kind of worried. So we started supporting some of these guys. Of course, you've got Russian support of the Assad regime. That's in their interest. And then you also have Iranian support of the Assad regime. All right, so who's in Syria? Well, and why does Iran even care about this? Well, as you can see, Iran cares about this. Here's Iran. All right, they're in through Iraq. Their interest here is to maintain that land bridge. Okay? That's their key interest. And I have an anecdote here. When I got back from Iraq, I started working for a defense company that was really interested in building a border right here, all right? And there were procurement officials. We had there was an RFP out. We were bidding for it. We had a whole plan for border security. Well, that got nixed big time. And I always said, why did that get nixed? We worked so hard on that project, and it got totally killed by the Iraqi government. Well, Iran doesn't want a border here. Iran doesn't want Iraq to have control of their sovereignty, because that kills their ability to get over here to the Mediterranean, all right? So who is in Syria? Okay, these are the main armed groups and who is supporting them, all right? But believe it or not, there's a lot of Hashid that came over to Syria. Also in Syria, you have the, very interestingly enough, you've got a brigade of mercenaries from Afghanistan and Pakistan, okay, that have been co-opted. The Fatimid Brigade, okay, is what they call themselves. Finally, Yemen. What's going on in Yemen? Because I'm going to run out of time here, okay? I want to have a discussion and open this up to questions. So Yemen, North and South Yemen, it was a British protectorate. Believe it or not, there was some Egyptian intervention in the country back in the 60s. They left. The country was in civil war, reunited in the 90s, and now they're kind of splitting along different factions again. Who's in Yemen? Okay, Yemen is predominantly Shia and predominantly Zaidi, okay? And that's in the north of Yemen. Who was, well, I'll move on. Okay. Who was in charge of Yemen? Okay, up until the current conflict, you had the General Party Congress, okay? And the General Party Congress, the leader was this guy, President Saleh. President Saleh was very keen on making friends with the West. And so much so that he actually acquired a lot of weapons from the West, all right? His biggest problem was that different factions in the country saw him as, one of these leaders that was, appropriating money from the people, being a dictator, somebody that they wanted to overthrow. Okay, so during the Arab Spring, he got a lot of pushback. And the most successful pushback came from this group, Ansar Allah. All right. President Saleh made a critical error. Okay, he pushed back on them at first. Then there was a point where he decided that he would actually join them. And when he joined them, they convinced him to release all the weapons in the Yemeni national arsenal, many of which that we had provided, to Ansar Allah. They got those weapons, and it wasn't long before President Saleh was back out of the picture. Well, he realized that he probably couldn't get along with these guys and tried to defect again. He was killed, okay? Since then, Yemen's been locked in this strange deadlock between Ansar Allah's forces and the successor to Saleh in the General Party Congress, okay? The General Party Congress has the support of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, rightly so. They're very worried about those weapons from the national arsenal. Iran saw this as an opportunity to insert themselves. Now, Iran really had nothing to do with this group. Okay, in fact, this version of Shia Islam is nothing like the Iranian version. And Ansar Allah has come out and said, look, our relationship has nothing to do with religion with Iran. It's purely political, purely, advantageous for us to be in bed with Iran right now, because Iran is helping us do all these cool different things, okay? They're helping us with training. They're helping us with, remodifying missiles. They're helping us, deal with all of these weapons that we have in the national arsenal, okay? Iran is helping out with that. North Korea is helping out with that. But there's a lot of plausible deniability here. A lot of times, Yemen goes through Hezbollah in order to get information to Yemen. Iran, a lot of times, goes undetected in Yemen. So, a lot of things are sort of like, the sources, unnamed Lebanese officials, said, Iran was here to bring weapons to Yemen. But can you really trust these sources? So, this is all, again, open media, all right? So, what does this all mean? Let's draw this to a conclusion. So some vulnerabilities here, and this is where I think we can have a lot of discussion. In Iraq, what I see is the biggest vulnerabilities, okay? There's a lot of animosity between these two countries, historical animosity, and also, even in the past 40 years, there's been a lot of animosity. And that doesn't go away overnight. Muqtada al-Sadr, believe it or not, his resilience is, thwarts Iranian influence. And then Ayatollah Sistani is so much more legitimate than the Ayatollahs in Iran. So much more. Okay, in Yemen, at some point, the Houthis might realize they don't need Iran there anymore. Once they have complete control over that country, or there's some sort of stalemate or agreement between the General Party Congress, I don't think they're going to need Iran there. And there are some religious fault lines between the Yemeni sect and the Iranian sect. Finally, in Syria, their need for Iranian assistance is diminishing. And oh, by the way, they have a backer. They have Russia. So they don't need Iran as much. And eventually, they might want to balance against Iranian influence, okay? Finally, Iran. Iran has their own vulnerabilities. Inside Iran, Iranian Kurds are probably their biggest vulnerability. They have huge cleavages in their own country, and they are very worried that we're going to use the same playbook that they use and start exploiting their cleavages. In fact, they're so worried about this, they're already meeting with Iranian Kurds in Oslo to prevent any Western or US influence trying to stoke the fire here, okay? The Ahwaz region is the Arab region inside Iran. Another point of contention. The let's see, did I put, yeah, the Mujahideen al-Khalq. Okay, so they're outside Iran. But this is an opposition group, and believe it or not, they're very worried about this. Mujahideen al-Khalq is kind of like, that group in exile that says that once you overthrow the regime, they can come in and take over the government. Now, we're a little bit gun-shy about that because of our experience in Iraq, but Iran definitely sees it as a vulnerability, okay? They rely on the Russians and the Chinese. I give you the example of Iraq on the eve of the first Gulf War. Iraq also relied on the Russians. Tariq Aziz flew to Moscow in February of 1991, seeking Moscow's assistance in what he perceived was the inevitable. And Moscow denied it, okay? These are not, Russia's been a very reliable ally for Syria. But will they be a reliable ally for Iran? Reluctance to fight a conventional army, definitely a weakness. They won't go there. Okay, their cyber is owned by the state. They're very controlling over that. Weakness. Air insuperiority is what I call it. Okay, and finally, the supply lines through what they call the Shia Crescent, that land bridge to the Mediterranean. This is their bread and butter. All right, if they can't get what they need through that supply line, it's a big problem, okay? I opened up for questions and discussion. Okay.
Mark Smith, I'm with Special Operations University. One of the vulnerabilities that you really didn't get into. One of the vulnerabilities you did not mention, but I'm sure it's there, is the youth bulge in Iran, and how that is also something that we can help to fraction or help to mobilize.
Yeah, I agree. Actually, across the entire Middle East, there's a huge youth bulge, and I think with the right, with the right sort of what do you call it, MISO or psychological operations, I think that's definitely an exploitable population, especially since the state-owned cyber infrastructure is terrible. They don't have access to all the things that this generation finds interesting. So if you can somehow circumvent that, a lot of them try to circumvent that, that's definitely an exploitable population, okay?
Please wait for the microphone to ask your question. Thank you.
Herman Hewitt from Kingfisher. If you look back at the Arab Spring in reference to youth and the uprising, one of the key issues in reference to us trying to predict how are they going to fall under, or are they going to fall under any of these fractions if something was to happen that happened a couple of years ago, and how would we be prepared to handle that based on them understanding, well, where do they go, right? I mean, what are their decision-making process in reference to what they want and what they want to do? So
my perception of that is, I look to Egypt as an example. In Egypt, there was a youth bulge and lots of momentum towards sort of more of a Western-style democracy until that was co-opted by the Muslim Brotherhood. The issue that the Egyptian youth, the Egyptian young people had, was that they weren't as organized as the Muslim Brotherhood. And they had very noble intentions, but the Muslim Brotherhood sort of capitalized on what was going on, stepped right in, but they were more organized. They came out in what was perceived to be greater numbers, and whereas the Egyptian youth were disparate, disorganized, relative to the Muslim Brotherhood. So I think that I think organization and longevity is part of that.
Right, so that becomes a problem in reference to us understanding what direction any movement is going to go based on who capitalizes on that movement.
Exactly. I agree with that.
Hi, Dave Ellis, Joint Special Operations University. Diane, could you talk about the social services component of
Sure.
the brigades and what that means to the politics, and particularly why the Sadr victory as an Iraqi nationalist component of that matters for us and how we think about the environment?
Sure, that is a great question. So, the social service component of these proxy groups is very important. So when these proxy groups go into a place initially, a lot of times it's under the auspices of, hey, look, we're gonna help you do some refurbishment. You know, we'd like to help you with your social services. We noticed garbage has been piling up, or you need to refurbish this tourist attraction, we can do that for you. So they insert themselves in, and then once they get there, sometimes they will co-opt the location, turn a mosque into a Husaniya, start collecting taxes on the tourist site, you know, buy property around the area, and suddenly it's not Iraq anymore, it's Iran, or mini Iran, or Iran inside Iraq. And what Sadr has done is really push back against that, and his constituency is the Arab Street. It's the poor Shia. But one thing about Sadr that has been very consistent with his narrative is he's always put Iraq first. And he's very much the Iraqi nationalist. And he won't bend to Iran, nor will he bend to the United States. So in a way, he's emerged victorious because he's stuck so strongly to that narrative, where a lot of Iraqis are getting really fed up with Iran. You know, like, they have to kowtow to Iran, but they're fed up with it. I'll give you the example of a friend of mine, okay? Anwar. Anwar has a company that does up-armoring of Humvees and up-armoring of privately owned vehicles for people that are really afraid. A great business. He makes a lot of money in Iraq. You know, one day, he's in his office, and a guy from, one of the Iranian proxies comes by with an embassy official from Iran, working in Baghdad. They come to his office and they say, hey, we would like to get into partnership with you. And he says, I'm not really that interested in being your partner. I've got sanctions to worry about. I've got a great business on my own. I don't need anything. Okay, they said, okay, you have 48 hours to think about it. Less than 48 hours later, okay, they completely take over his office. He's out, now they own his up-armored shop, okay? And then they threaten him by telling him they know where all his family lives, okay? So that's, you can see that power insertion, what can you do about that? You cannot say no, all right? And you have to be a willing participant with this, or else, Okay.
I have two questions from online. Two questions.
Yeah.
Why at this time did the arrest of 12 men on charges of espionage? Question number 2, would you characterize MEK as a terror group?
What was the second question?
Would you characterize MEK as a terror group?
Oh, that's a good question. So the first question, I think Iran is playing the cards that it has, okay? And that, the president said that was fake news, so it might be. Or they could just be, they feel squeezed, or they're worried about what we might do. So just like they did during the Iranian hostage crisis, they hold some people hostage. They know that we value human life. Okay, we'll do anything to save our people, usually. And so, that's a card that they can play. I think with the Mujahideen al-Khalq, they were on the terrorist group list, and Hillary Clinton got them off, I think in like the, late 2000s, 9, 10, 11, 12, somewhere in there. Mujahideen al-Khalq's really interesting. They were taking up, they were living at Victory Base, Liberty, after the U.S. departed. They lived there for a while. They're a huge group, and then they sort of got chalked off to Paris, and some of them came to the U.S., and they've met with different politicians. They're very keen on getting back into Iran, and they have a lot of longevity too. Okay, I don't characterize them as a terrorist group because they're on our side now.
And then one more question.
Yeah.
So we successfully divide and exploit the factions, division, and weaken the hegemony. What is the long-term strategy to handle the subsequent regional volatility?
What's the long-term strategy?
What is the long-term strategy to handle the subsequent regional volatility?
Well, Iran's or the US's? Okay, so I would say Iran's long-term strategy is regional hegemony at all costs. And, you know, they're slowly penetrating, and their desire is to be able to export the Islamic Revolution. That is their long-term game. And, you know, they might not be able to accomplish it in their lifetime, but that is their goal, export the Islamic Revolution. Wilayat al-Faqih, okay? Guardianship by the jurist. That's their goal. Our goal, I think, is to stabilize the region, maintain the status quo, territorial sovereignty, freedom of the navigation, you know, free trade. That's our goal.
Diane, is volatility necessarily bad for Iran?
No, absolutely not. I would say volatility enables Iran to penetrate places. For instance, imagine, you know, you are a pest control service, okay? And your neighbor does not have any pests. Well, it's in your interest that he has some pests, so you can go get rid of the pests, right? So a lot of people can't make that connection, but Iran will enable the pests. They'll play both sides. They'll help you get rid of the pests, and then they'll make sure that you constantly have pests. Okay, by pests I mean Islamic State. Okay, so they'll enable Islamic State so that way they can come in and save the day against Islamic State. Absolutely, that's their playbook. Yeah.
Simon Bolin, Hillsborough County. Iran is a huge agricultural producer, and they're the world's #1 producer of saffron. How do you, and that would be the largest commodity going across that land bridge. How do you see that play into sanctions and different actions with the surrounding countries?
So I think if we put sanctions on goods that they rely on, they'll start relying on black market goods that are really hard for us to sanction. So you'd see an uptick in things like, you know, body parts. Okay, they're very big in trafficking body parts. You'll see an uptick in kidnapping children so they can export body parts. You'll see an uptick in heroin coming out of the country, an uptick in basically any nefarious good that is sold on the black market. You know, they've got to make the money somehow, and these are very high return on investment items. One good shipment can land you a lot of money. So I think you'd see an uptick in that. If you know, the more you crunch over here, the more you see an uptick over here.
So James Scott from SOCOM here.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'll stand up.
Oh, okay.
So we've touched on it throughout the whole brief, but is there essentially a standard playbook for the Iranian infiltration of these you know, Shia diasporas? And then is that, you know, played out the same way over and over again, like a TTP or SOP book, like it played out with Lebanese Hezbollah, or is it different based on each situation, or is it still just divide, control by any means necessary and work your way in that way?
I think Lebanese Hezbollah was their most successful proxy. So they are using a lot, they're using Lebanese Hezbollah as that model across the region. And in fact, Lebanese Hezbollah come and train in a lot of places. So yeah, I think, you know, I don't know if they actually have like a written playbook or they have a Hegemony 101 class in their war college, but I would venture to say that they probably do have a doctrine or some TTPs that actively explain this, because the British sure did. The British had some playbooks when they were in India that sort of went that direction, although not as I make it sound a little bit more nefarious, but
So I've heard Lebanese model over and over again for several years now, but I've
Yeah.
never actually read it or seen it, other than like doing my own research on how they
Yeah.
kind of infiltrated. Have you done the research to like build that model?
I haven't found anybody that wrote out the model. It's just sort of based on the perception of what you see going on. But if anybody knows of it, I would be very interested. Yeah, yeah.
Hello, Dr. Zorri. Thank you for coming here. My question is, you talked about the political and military return on investment from
Yeah.
Iran. I've been seeing a lot of reports on their influence operations, especially through things like Facebook. Looks like they're using the Russian models, and as well as their cyber hacking teams. Can you talk about how they're adding to their capabilities using that type of hybrid warfare type of things?
Yes, a little bit. So what they have done, I mean, they have a lot of people there that understand our social media very well. Young people, people that know English perfectly. So they're able to use our own tools against us. Family Tree Now. You can find out a lot on there. PrivateEye.com, Facebook, Instagram. And they do the same things that you might do if you were stalking somebody, okay? Like look that person, find out everybody they're associated with, go on Family Tree Now, see all the places that they've lived, Google those places, find out where they are in Google Maps, and then find out everybody affiliated with them, go on Facebook. So many people have a Facebook, and then you just start to fill in this picture of who everybody is, and they'll do that with pilots. They'll do that with American officials and embassies, American officials working abroad. They'll have, Iranian people start to put together a dossier on everybody, and that's how they're able to penetrate what's going on. LinkedIn is another one, absolutely.
Well, in regards to hacking teams, you're seeing them hack things like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, and all that stuff. Is that fall into how they're just trying to make money? Does that fall into some of their financial gains and things like that, and hacking banks and everything like that?
Yes, yeah. I mean, so ransomware, that's the modern day piracy, basically.
Do you see them decreasing the military and political and putting more emphasis on those things?
I think it all depends on budgeting. So, as we roll in sanctions and things get very tight for them, they're going to have to pick and choose what's going to give them the most bang for their buck.
So, Sam Altman, Booz, Alan, on that topic, actually, from the other way, would you be able, sorry, I should stand up.
Okay.
On the comment that you made on state-owned cyber vulnerabilities, I was wondering if you might be able to pull the thread on that a little bit more and just say, well, particularly from maybe like a context of opportunities for our particular offensive cyber training, where that might be.
So, yeah, and I'm not a cyber expert, but there are points in their cyber infrastructure that rely on like that one source. Okay, so they don't have like backups for your backup for your backup. So you take out the cyber infrastructure. Iran is in a very weakened position. And they've created this backbone. I mean, the way I understand it, they've got like 2 or 3 state-owned enterprises that are running their cyber infrastructure. So, like with anything with a social, when socialists or state-owned enterprises, it's never really that good, okay? I mean, maybe theirs is amazing compared to other socialist-style cyber systems, but I would doubt it. Okay, so I just think that would be something that's very easily exploitable.
Is Iran's true goal to protect and expand Persians and Shia presence and influence in the world? If so, doesn't this create a volatile dynamic with Saudi Arabia for dominant hegemon in the region?
Yes, so I'll go back to one of my slides. If you look at, once Iraq was taken out as a major hegemon, okay? You see this big rock slide cascade, and there's maybe 3 or 4 hegemons now competing for primacy in this region. All right, you've got Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Israel to a certain extent, okay? And I think that the play here is Iran saw an opportunity to exert itself, and they took it. Why wouldn't you? All right, but they're getting a lot of pushback, and I don't think Saudi Arabia, I think Saudi Arabia and Iran, I think that, that's a major confrontation that's looming because both are seeking hegemony, and both have a very different interpretation of Islam. I'll leave it at that. Yeah. Oh.
Sure. I'm Megan O'Keefe from SOCCENT. So my question has to do with the diasporas. So the largest Lebanese population in the world is in South America. And over the last couple of years, we've seen a major rise in the development of mosques. And some would argue that the movement of drugs can oftentimes occur through religious institutions. So is it possible that either Russia or Iran are capitalizing on those diasporas to encourage instability?
If you're looking at the proxy organizations, and our focus is initially on, they're Shia, they're all Shia.
Yeah.
Right? So we see the Shia connection. What are we missing analytically that we should be focusing on to find the division points, where they are vulnerable? Is there any commonality across the 3 case studies that you looked at?
There's some commonality. I think that my own perception, yes. So, the big break, there really is a divide between Sistani and Najaf, where Sistani lives. That brand of Shia Islam is sort of the guiding light, the Pope, if you will, of the Shia. I think that the perception of Iran and that brand is a little bit more ephemeral, although it's exciting. And so Sistani hasn't really come out. He stays very, very apolitical. It's not like he's come out and said, that's bad, or that's wrong, or we shouldn't follow that brand. He's a little bit more eternal and religious. He doesn't make statements like that necessarily. So, but there is a big divide, okay? But when people are trying to survive, a lot of times they will do like Saddam Hussein said. They will bandwagon when it's in their interest. So if this guy's paying me, or this guy's protecting me, or this guy's telling me he's going to kill my family unless I do what he says, they'll go along with it for the time being, okay? But there really is a big divide between, the ideology of Sistani versus the ideology of Khomeini. Completely different, okay? And that's an exploitable cleavage, absolutely. When it comes to the Yemeni, the Houthi are Zaidi. The Zaidi sect is very similar. It's actually more similar to Sunni Islam than it is to the Shia Twelvers, okay, which is predominant in Iran. So I think there's definitely a cleavage there. And then when you're looking at Syria, it's majority Sunni in Syria. So yeah, there's definitely some religious cleavages there.
What about tribal identity? Are there tribes across the region that have both Sunni and Shia members, and is there a way that could be leveraged?
Yes. So unfortunately, I think what's happened in the region is we've typologized this Sunni-Shia divide, and it's not necessarily the way that people see themselves, although over time, because it's been reinforced so much that it's become the dominant framework for how people are self-identifying. But I don't think it's always been that way. I think that tribal identity goes back a lot further. Family identity is a lot stronger than some of these religious narratives and religious cleavages that have been formed. So I think at the end of the day, though, what's in the interest of the United States is that people identify with their country, and people identify with the sovereign nation that is represented in the United Nations. That's in our interest. Whether or not the people are actually comfortable with that is another thing. Okay, but that's what's, in my opinion, in the United States' interest, is that people identify with the country that they're in.
Is that in Iran's interest?
That is not in Iran's interest.
One question? No, one question over here.
Hi, I'm Liz Durr with Similarity, and I'm curious about Yemen. If it's a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia, both of who are very powerful, why haven't we solved it? Why hasn't somebody won yet? Why do they keep kind of pointing and poking at Saudi Arabia without actually achieving anything?
I think, so, I think it's like one of these slow, it's just slow. It will get resolved at some point. I think that, over the course of the conflict, there's been ebbs and flows. And I think every time that there's an ebb, there's the hope that it'll calm down, we'll come to a resolution, the ceasefire will hold, and then it heats back up again. And that's why it's been taking so long. But I think the Houthi have the momentum right now. But as soon as there's a stop in the conflict, it just heats right back up again. So it just kind of keeps going. Yeah.
I have one question from online. What unit is associated with APT 33, and does Iranian cyber operative on coercive influence levels or simple intrusion and network reconnaissance?
I'm not as familiar with the second part of the question, and I don't know what PT 33 was.
APT 33.
It's stands for Advanced Persistent Threat. It's a cybersecurity issue.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure.
I might be able to elaborate on that.
Yeah.
If I may.
Yeah.
I actually. Hey, Tom, don't make me stand up. All right. Good morning. Hi. I actually had to take conference calls this morning. I'm so sorry I arrived late, but I actually was curious because I read your paper yesterday, and the paper that you had elaborated on was mostly on conventional weapons, which of course is always a main concern, especially for our U.S. military. However, a lot of our war front, if you now will, is almost, it's almost on critical infrastructure now. Cyber threats have become almost a war front as in itself. The people who are on the front lines now are actually like really corny nerds. We like to sit in the corners. We don't like to socialize and all that fun stuff. So we're very silly people. But I actually am curious about your opinion of how the U.S. is going to respond if there is any diplomatic relations with Iranian cyber threats, because they do have, if you will, alliances with Russia and North Korea, or at least we'll go with non-U.S. friendlies, if you will. Do you have an opinion on how the U.S. foreign relations will apply when it comes to cyber threat actors, if you will, APT 33?
Okay. Well, so again, Iran is seeking, because they don't want to get into a conventional conflict with the United States. So they're using everything in their playbook that has nothing to do with conventional warfare. So cyber is a great front for them. And I think, with Iran, what I've noticed is a lot of tit for tat. We do this, they do that. We do this, they do that. So my prediction would be that, as their cards start to run out, they start moving into more of these realms. And, co-opting other actors to help them in that space. And again, I'm not a cyber expert by any means. I can only speak from sort of the 25,000-foot level of sort of this balancing act that I foresee.
Hi, Dr. Zorri. Berkeley Almeida with Frame. We do high-resolution human geography population characteristic data. Heard a lot about kind of the population in Iran, the youth bulge, and then the diasporas of the Lebanese and South America. I wonder if you could discuss more how important it is to go beyond like the religious and ethnic understanding of the local population to really access to services. I know anecdotally people will say that the Iranian people actually kind of like us. They don't hate us. It's the regime. We are, as a company, keenly interested in helping the community and the research community understand local populations beyond just religious and ethnic groups. While those are important, more so understanding just other aspects of those local populations. Thank you.
Sure. No, I think obviously it's extremely important to know, understand the country that you're dealing with, understand the cleavages and the divides, and understand the demographics, understand that there's a lot of young people there that want the internet, and maybe that's something that we can get to them to win some soft power. I think there's a lot of ways that we can get soft power inside Iran. And soft power would be, for those of you that aren't poli-sci geeks, soft power would be everything that makes you likable that has nothing to do with the military aspect. So kind of like that popular guy in high school. Well, he's not a bully. People don't like him because he's a bully. People like him because he maybe sings songs at parties, or he's a really good athlete. So it's all the things that you do in the international sphere to make others like you. And there's a lot of things that we can do to get the majority of the Iranian people to like us. And a lot of them do like us. They like the music of the United States. They like our food. They like our culture. They like the freedom that we have. And exposing Iranians more to those cultural things, I think, is a good thing. But I go back to what I perceive as some of the biggest vulnerabilities in that country, and I go back to the Kurds. I think co-opting Kurdish support would be really, really difficult for the regime in Tehran to take. I think that's a sore spot for them. They fear that. So by leveraging the Kurds, I think that the U.S. could have a huge impact. You want up there? Yep.
Kurt Hastings, Kingfisher. I think you sort of half answered my question, but you made a very interesting remark in response to his question about American interest in the region, that people more identify with their national identity rather than a tribal or religious identity. And I know you didn't have a lot of time, but talking about the very complex internal political structure of Iran, what do you see as the hope for Iran to evolve in that direction versus whether they're just trapped because of geographic or ethnic considerations, whether the United States can exert influence to push Iran in that direction? Thank you.
So my own opinion on this is that we've been on a slow collision course with this country since the 50s. I just think, especially after the Islamic Revolution of '79, I think that regime is really incompatible, and their policies are really incompatible with the world writ large. So I think eventually that regime is going to come to its end. How quick that happens, I can't say. And how we bring that about, I think there's different ways that you could force that and different ways that it could happen in its own time. But I think that the timeline of that regime is very limited. And when I say limited, I don't think they're going to last into my great-grandchildren's lifetime. Okay, so I'll say 75 years. I don't think they'll last that long. But between now and 75 years is a long time. So we can force, we could end it tomorrow. President Trump said that. We could end it tomorrow. He's right. We could end it tomorrow. But do we want to be that drastic? Or do we let it die out on its own? Because it will die out. It's just not compatible with the world. And the people of that country, there's enough of them that, it's not going to last. It's just a matter of how fast we want it to happen, in my opinion.
Is Iran using ethnicity-based nationalism as a mechanism for projection of subversion power in other nations, similar to Russian nationals being empowered in Ukraine by Russia?
I don't see it in that way so much. The way that I see Iran is more, they're very proud of their own identity. A lot of Iranians see themselves as Persian first. So you have to think, when the United States was celebrating its 200-year anniversary, Iran had they had a big party, the Shah came out for their 2,500-year anniversary of the Persian Empire. Okay, so they have a memory, sort of that cultural memory that's, for them, thousands of years old. And that's Persia, okay? And a lot of them identify as Persian first. And they project that supremacy. They have a long memory into all the things that Persia ever did. And they're proud of that. And they want to re-amplify that. At least the Shah wanted to re-amplify that image on the world stage. And a lot of Iranians still have that notion of glory. Whether there's an Ayatollah in Tehran or a Shah, they still believe in Persian dominance.
And one more question. One more. What is the state of organized labor in Iran, and what is it a vector to recruit internal integrators?
What is the state of organized labor in Iran? I cannot give a good answer to this question. I'm really sorry. I don't know. I'll be honest. I don't know everything. I have no idea. Sorry.
Yes, I'm up.
Yeah.
Hello. Jamie Cormier, Mark Logic. So do you see a viable organization that would be able to coalesce against the supreme leader? I mean, since to this point, they've basically all, effectiveness has been muted. And how do we assist them if such an organization does exist? And also, what would it look like after, the regime was replaced, essentially?
So I think Mujahideen al-Khalq wants that job. The problem is we had high hopes when we were ousting the Ba'ath Party back in 2003. We had the Iraqi National Congress, and that didn't go so well. We had a leader that we had identified that could, come in and sort of take over. That was Ahmed Shalabi. Well, would you believe Ahmed Shalabi was taking money not only from us, from the CIA, he was also taking money from Iran, okay? So you have to be really careful about who you put into that job. We had England had their candidate, Great Britain had their candidate, that was Ayatollah Sistani, and that was maybe a good candidate, but for many reasons, which I cannot talk about here, but I could talk about it forever later, that guy did not get the job either. Okay, and that might have been a mistake, but we can talk about that later. So anyway, Ahmed Shalabi was not the guy that we thought he was. Okay, he was playing us. He was very smart. He was like a PhD in mathematics, and he was smart enough to realize he could make a lot of money if he played both Iran and the CIA against each other. So we have to be really careful about who we put into that job, but it's something we've done in the past. I mean, Miriam Rohavi, she's the leader of the MEK, she wants that job, and she's ready to step in tomorrow if we gave her that job. So, I mean, yeah, there are people ready to go, and Mujahideen al-Khalq is huge. I mean, I think it's like 40,000 people in exile. So, I mean, you're talking about a huge organization here, nothing like what Ahmed Shalabi had. I mean, we're talking a huge amount of people. So they probably could do the job. Whether or not the Iranians are going to support that, I don't know. Yeah.
But Diane, it seems to me the story, if we're looking at Iranian proxies, and we're all here because we're like, how the hell are they doing this so well?
Yeah.
The point that you made early on was they're not looking external. They don't care about the external organizations. They're finding disaffected local constituencies that they can seed an operative into and build out. And when it gets too big for his britches, they divide it and move it on to a separate constituency. So the story is
Yeah.
less about what's the external play in, it's how do they identify the vulnerabilities of particular communities. And to your question, it seems to me what you pointed to is they're using sectarian identity, Shiism, as the umbrella of a disaffected community. And then they're like, what's your immediate need and how do I provide that assistance? Am I hearing you right? Or
Yes.
am I off?
No, I think in in Iraq especially, there's always been this narrative, there's been a history of oppression of the Shia in Iraq. So now's their moment. About 13 years ago, a professor of mine at Naval Postgraduate School, Vali Nasser, wrote a fabulous book that was a New York Times bestseller called The Shia Revival. Okay, great name, because it was really the revival of Shiism. It was their moment. And Iran has really capitalized on that history of oppression, that history of being downtrodden, that history of being, the lesser people, and built them back up again. And capitalized on that boosting of them, boosting them up. But a lot of them are starting to see through it now. They're saying, what's in it for me? Maybe my life was actually better under Saddam Hussein than it is under these Iranian proxies who are making my life very difficult. And that is a constant theme heard on the Iraqi street. Life was better under Saddam Hussein. And it's not Sunni saying it, it's Shia saying it. But they can't say it, there's an Iranian guy down the street, you can't say it too loud, right? But it is said.
China, what is the Belt and Road Plan in Iran? How is this relationship characterized?
Okay, so the Chinese, the way that I see the Chinese, and this is an overgeneralization, okay, based on my limited experience with China, but the Chinese are in a lot of places. So I have a friend that worked at the Iraqi airport. Would you believe the Chinese had a major contract at that airport? They had a whole camp there, and this is like a few years ago. Whole camp there, Chinese workers, Chinese everything, like 50 or 60 people living, working, doing airport cleanup, doing the trash. There's a lot of things that go on at an airport, right? It employs a lot of people. Chinese had a major contract. And there was a missile that came in and hit near their camp. Did they make a big deal about it? No, they just moved their camp over a little bit, okay? Americans would make a big deal, they'd have meetings, they'd, talk about it, come up with some sort of SOP for going forward. If we're gonna have our people here, you can't have them accidentally die. The Chinese are more, they're inserting themselves, but at the end of the day, from what I understand, the Chinese are there to make money. They're not there to get involved with the politics. They're there to capitalize, and if people die in the process, that's the name of the game there. So wherever they can make money, they try to make money, they bid on contracts, they do the work. They're not there to ruffle political feathers. They don't care who's in charge. They really don't. They just care about getting contracts.
John from SOCOM asks, has the IRGC become too powerful for the current or future supreme leader to control? Are we seeing the beginning of an oligarchy?
That's a good question. I don't know. I have to think about that. That's actually a really good point. Maybe they are. I haven't ever thought about that. I mean, what's interesting is Qasem Soleimani. So he's the he's the Iranian guy in Iraq, and for a long time his face wasn't showing up anywhere. You'd hear about him. It was like Elvis. I heard Elvis there was like a Qasem Soleimani sighting. And then all of a sudden, you started to see his face everywhere. And you had to wonder, okay, why is this guy showing up everywhere all the time? But they were controlling that narrative of this guy is great. He's here to save the day. He's the man. He's the general Petraeus of the situation. Okay, and imagine how that bolstered up Iranian identity. Okay, you guys had your General Petraeus, we have our Qasem Soleimani. Okay, and that the Americans couldn't handle it. We're here to handle it. We got our guy on the ground, and he's Mr. Everything. All right.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the Iranian Kurds. Talk about how we could leverage that if they're the weakest group and they're more communist or socialist than we like to normally associate with.
Okay, so what's really interesting about the Kurds, and I've done a lot of work on Iraqi Kurdish groups. Sometimes that face will change depending on who's in power. So, you're communist one day and you're pledging allegiance to Che Guevara, the next minute you're pledging allegiance to, the United States of America. So it really, I wouldn't say that they're, sold on socialism or sold on communism necessarily. What is very interesting is that the Kurds were a big help to the United States in fighting ISIS. They were a big help when we were in Iraq, from 2003 to 2011 timeframe. And I think there's a lot of Kurdish folks in Washington promoting the idea of a Kurdish state, an independent Kurdish state. They sort of have like quasi-sovereignty in Iraq, but the hesitation on our part was always, okay, there's Kurds not only in Iraq, but they're in Syria, they're in Turkey, they're in Iran. We don't want to anger Turkey. We need Turkey on our side. They're a NATO member. We need that access through the Dardanelles because of the Russian threat. That's a strategic ally. But I've got to say, this might be the Kurds' moment, and here's why. Turkey has been very duplicitous. And not only that, they're even buying Russian surface-to-air missiles, right? Or they're buying the S-400. It really goes against what NATO wants. So maybe this is the Kurdish moment, okay? Maybe this is the time that we look at, say, hey, Turkey's not really our friend anymore. Iraqi Kurds, you sure did help us. Syrian Kurds, you sure did help us fight Islamic State. And oh, by the way, we need to push hard on Iran. Maybe now is the time for the Kurds, okay? There's probably Kurds out there thinking that. I would be thinking that if I was Kurdish, okay? Point to ponder.
I'm Lieutenant Colonel Marine from the SOCOM. I just have a comment about what you just said about to get support from the Kurds in Iraq, Syria, and Turkey and Iran. Even if if the United States try to support the Kurds and try to help them to establish their country over there, the future of this country will not be successful, because if you look, you cannot create a country surrounding by all the neighbors. They do not want this country to be exist. So if we look to the history, when the the United States were supporting the Kurds all the time, when it comes to create the country, they stop. Even 2 years ago, if you remember, when the Kurds try to do a referendum to see if they can establish their country in Iraq, the United States decision was not to say yes or say no, not to support it.
Yeah, the Kurds they're in a difficult position. They're landlocked, it's mountainous. But there are other landlocked mountainous countries that are very successful. I'd say Switzerland, landlocked and mountainous. So, their geography is limiting, but maybe it could be an advantage for them.
I notice you don't list economic sanctions as one of the vulnerabilities, but that's one of the things that we hear our government is doing to try and affect Iran. Why is that not a vulnerability?
So it is a vulnerability, but I think, whenever we put sanctions on a country, it's this balancing act. So they'll find another way. And what sanctions tend to do, and I saw this in Iraq when I studied a lot of Iraqi history. What happened in Iraq was when they were under sanctions, so they were under sanctions after the first Gulf War, very intense sanctions, but it really enabled a class of people who were very good at logistics, trafficking things, and moving goods unnoticed. And so while on the open market, it was really hard to get things, there was a class of people that on the black market that became very, very rich and powerful and successful. And so you can put sanctions on a country, and I think it's the right move, don't get me wrong, But I think that from Iran's perspective, it hurts them, but it also empowers other actors. And those actors are not necessarily great people. They're people that can move things on the black market.
Sorry for standing up for the fourth time, but I just love this topic. So if I had to summarize kind of how you're looking at the proxy organizations.
Yeah.
Their effectiveness is really built around finding vulnerabilities within the host government. Their hegemony 101 kind of model is, I don't want stability.
Yeah.
I want instability in these countries that I'm targeting. And then how do I find local constituencies that I can exploit because the state relationship with that population is non-existent or tenuous at best?
Exactly.
So how do I think about, say, an Iraq?
Mm-hmm.
If I'm the United States, where if I know Iran's strategy for hegemony is instability and they want persistent instability to have that relevance to those groups, how do I think about an al-Sadr in the modern era? And how do I think about what Iraqi nationalism might be able to do with a constituency that includes Shia and Sunni and secular civil state and Kurds and so on and so forth? How do I neutralize their strategy of hegemony based on what we're seeing with this current social movement with al-Sadr and his political bloc?
I love Dave. He gave me the idea for this paper, by the way. So I love that question. So if I was Iraq, or what would help Iraq push back against Iran? I think what Iran really fears is a strong Iraq, a strong, sovereign Iraq that looks out for its own interests. But remember what Saddam Hussein said. The Iraqis will bandwagon with the stronger power. And what's very interesting in Iraq right now is that you have different political factions that would really kowtow to Iranian interests. And as soon as the US exerts itself a little bit, they'll back off of that. They'll come off their statements, okay? So I think, in my opinion, I think the US is hesitant to get completely involved on the scale of what we were, how we were involved in the 2000 timeframe, the mid-2000s. But US involvement, I think, is key in helping Iraq ferment itself as a sovereign state that has control of its borders, a monopoly on the use of force, okay, control over its own military, and an economy that can take care of its people. Okay, and you'll see, I think, if you come in strong, I think, it's this balance. So if the US comes in, I see Iraq leaning towards the US, because they'll go with the stronger power.
Can I follow up on that, Diane?
Yeah.
Your earlier slide showed that we supported the organizations that were building essentially the Iranian proxies. Is that fair? So our mental model was Sadr was the bad guy,
Mm-hmm.
Dawa, Abadi, Maliki were our guys,
Mm-hmm.
and what we did was essentially support the very institutions that Iran wanted to use to assert its influence and destabilize the country.
Yes.
Is that a fair summation?
That's a fair summation.
So if we are going to move forward with a sense of what stability in our mind looks like, we have to undo 12 years of US foreign policy, which frankly SOCOM has been a big part of over the last couple of years, in supporting the very proxies that Iran wants. We have to shift our mental model to think Sadr is actually the Sistani-Sadr alliance is actually better for us than who we typically supported over the last 10 years. Is that?
Yes. So how do I explain this? Okay. This is 2010, okay? This is when Iraq, I think, really started to go sideways. So Iraqi politics, let's see if I have a slide. Yes. Okay, I wasn't going to show this one. Generally speaking, okay, this is by no means a scientific chart or anything like that. But if you generally think in terms of groups that were, operating in exile with the support of a foreign intelligence service, or parties that were organic to Iraq and Iraq only. Maybe they operated in Iran a little bit under Saddam Hussein, but they're really organic to Iraq. Or groups that are organic to Iraq but never conceded to outside interests, whether it be US or Iran. But you can see why Sadr is really the populist here, because he's organic to the country, not to say he didn't spend time in Iran, but he's organic, and he never bent to our interests. Whereas, you know, these guys were totally concessionary. This is Ayatollah Allawi, this is Ahmed Shalabi. You know, this was MI6's guy, and this was the CIA's guy. These guys were not popular, okay? The Iraqis didn't like them. And these guys, okay, are sort of what's left over, all right? And what we ended up doing was we ended up supporting the guys in the suit and tie, okay? Because I have this bias. I think that we were just the most comfortable with them. They wore a suit and tie. They spoke English, okay?
And they were proxies, right?
Yeah, they had the longevity in the country. So what we did was during 2005, Iraqi politics were split along the Kurds, who always kind of vote in a block together, the Shia, okay, who voted in a block together, and this list, which looks big here, but in real life it was only 40 seats. This was the leftovers of the Sunnis. And Sunnis boycotted this election, okay? So who won? This huge Shia bloc, the majority faction. Okay, the majority faction won. They put the prime minister, that was Maliki, right? 2010 is where we lose it. So the Kurds, they vote in a block together again, like always. The Shia actually split. They split between Dawa, which is the guys in the suit and ties, and this religious these guys. This is where Iran has its influence. And then you had this third group that came out, or I'm sorry, this fourth group that had a lot of prominence. This group was actually led by Ayatollah Allawi, Great Britain's guy. All right, this group was secular. This group had the most Sunnis, but it also had Shia. Ayatollah Allawi himself is Shia. He's a prominent businessman, very wealthy. This group actually, remember, 2005, the Sunnis boycott. 2010, they come out in droves. All right? Who wins the election? Ayatollah Allawi's front. Okay, he gets the most votes. That really made Dawa unhappy. And we were supporting Dawa. Why? I've read a lot of accounts of this. I think Iran did not want Ayatollah Allawi in charge of that country, okay? Because and also put Sunnis back in the fold, and we saw that as dangerous. A lot of these guys are former Baathists, or we were afraid of the reemergence of the Baath Party. I don't really know, but for some reason, we convinced Ayatollah Allawi to step aside and to let Dawa have the prime minister. And that's when it all really got chaotic, because now the majority faction is in charge. We leave the country. Maliki goes hard on Sunnis. Islamic State pops up. We're not in the country to help control it. And Iran comes rushing in right here and here. I think these guys would love to have nothing to do with Iran in some respects, but they feel the same way about the United States. Okay? They're going to go with the more powerful organization by default because they want power. They want to be in charge.
One question. If U.S. sanctions are severe, would otherwise regular citizens in Iran be recruit potential via the trade of contraband? Can integration occur in organized crime? Spoof bad guys with good people.
Wait, can you repeat that?
If U.S. sanctions are severe, would otherwise regular citizens in Iran be recruit potential via the trade of contraband? Can integration occur in organized crime?
I think people will do what they have to do to survive. So somebody who might not normally traffic a high return on investment item might do that under sanctions in order to provide for their family. Absolutely, people do that all the time. We saw that in Iraq a lot during sanctions. I think that, can people be recruited? Can people immigrate? Yeah, I'm not really sure where the question is going, but I think people can immigrate. I mean, people will immigrate along the where they're trafficking things.
I think it was integrate.
Oh, integrate.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Can integration occur in organized crime was the last.
Can integration occur in organized crime? I will say yes. I'm not sure what kind of integration, but yeah.
And one more question. John from SOCOM again. With the diminishing mindset in the Iranian populace of revolutionary zeal, which propelled the regime to power, could the IRGC find some benefit in a smaller conflict with the U.S. to try to reconstruct a revolutionary identity?
I think that's absolutely possible. I think that, again, when you're focused on an external enemy, you're not as focused on your internal problems. And one problem that the Revolutionary Guard is facing and the Ayatollahs are facing is that fervor, diminishes as generations go by. So people think, yeah, this is not my father's war. We need to fight our own revolution. So revolutionaries are usually young. That's why the youth bulge is extremely critical.
How do we remain cognizant of that as a nation moving forward?
I think how do we remain cognizant? Keep the pulse on the situation.
Yeah. All right, we have time for one more question, and then we'll wrap it up. Does anyone have additional questions?
Just on that topic of sanctions, ma'am, Tom Park from SOCSENT here. With your understanding of the Iranian leadership and the Iranian people, do you think this current course is sustainable? Do you think we can starve them into submission?
I don't think you can starve them into submission, but I think you can push them into a corner where they start playing their cards, and we can exploit that. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much, Diane.
Thanks.
We really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.